We just started a Bible study in Sunday school on the book of James, and here we are in the last chapter of James as I preached a few sermons from James. We're going to read verses 7 through 11 of chapter 5. And the title of the message this morning is Spiritual Endurance in a Physical World. James chapter 5, verses 7 through 11. James writes, "Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, see as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. We have heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy." This past summer, I enjoyed watching the Summer Olympics on TV. I didn't see a whole lot of it, mostly at night. Around 10 o'clock or so, I'd turn on the TV just to get an update on what had happened during the day. And it seems like almost every time I turned it on, it was the races, the sprints and whatnot that were on. And I got to watch a lot more of that than I normally would. And one of the things one of the commentators said was that among racers, many of them, the 400-meter sprint is considered the most difficult race. Now, that was surprising to me. I would have thought the long races like the marathon were considered the most difficult. But he said the reason the 400-meter sprint is the most difficult is because it's a sprint. And that no runner, no matter how well trained he is, can sprint indefinitely. There's a limit to how far a human being can sprint. And for this 400-meter race, they sprint the whole time. And I thought about that as he said that, how similar to life that is. Life is not a sprint. We start out sometimes as Christians, we're so full of enthusiasm, so raring to go, and we figure out pretty early on that this isn't going to be a sprint to the finish line. Life is a very long race of endurance. And this is what James is talking about here, about how to live with spiritual endurance in a physical world, how to keep your faith in Christ up, to keep it strong, when all around you there are things that try to discourage you. So let's look a little more in depth at what James has to say to us in the passage this morning. He begins in verse 7 by telling us to be patient. Now, that word patient doesn't quite capture what James is saying to us. We don't really have a word in English that fully captures it, but we have a word that is the opposite of what he's saying. And the opposite of what he's saying is short-tempered. We all know what short-tempered means, right? If you're short-tempered, you lose your cool real easily. You're always, blowing a fuse. Any little thing sets you off. If this word that James uses were translated literally in English, he's saying, be long-tempered. He's acknowledging that in the world there are all sorts of things that can set you off. Any of you who still drive, you see it in Los Angeles every day, the road rage. Your son-in-law, Glenn, was telling me this week that just recently as he was driving, he must have done something, pulled in front of somebody or something unknowingly, and the guy started, pulling up to him real close, and then got around him on the side and rolled his window down and was shaking his fist at him and telling him he wanted him to get off the freeway to fight him. This is an everyday occurrence on the streets of Los Angeles. James is saying as a Christian, you need to be long-tempered, slow to anger, not retaliating quickly. We live in a wicked world. And as a Christian, you are going to have to put up with a lot that you don't like, a lot that doesn't suit you. And he's saying, be long-tempered in this world. And he gives us as examples of long-tempered individuals, or examples of the kind of patience he's talking about, 3 examples. He gives us, first of all, an example of a patient farmer. Look at what he says there in verse 7. He says, be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. When I was growing up, living at home, my dad had 2 very, very dear friends. One was a mechanic and one was a farmer. The farmer's name was Charlie Mancuso, and he had a farm in Plaquemines Parish in Louisiana, rural area outside of New Orleans. And he grew Creole tomatoes and shallots, and I don't remember some of the other things he grew. But every now and then I would go with my dad to Mr. Charlie's farm, and I remember we picked a lot of tomatoes while we were there. And I gave a lot of tomatoes and other crops to my dad. I learned a little bit up close and personal watching Mr. Charlie. He did what all good farmers do. You know, he tilled the soil, he planted the seeds, he watched over the tender plants, he waited for rain. He needed rain, but not too much, and he needed it at the right time. He needed sunshine, but not too much and not too hot. Sometimes the farmers here in California, they get way too much sun and no rain at all while we're in the drought. They're almost at the mercy of the elements. But if a farmer is diligent in what he does, if he works hard, if he takes care, if he does everything that's in his power to do, and then he waits and hopes and trusts in the Lord, eventually he's rewarded with a good crop. You could say that outside of hard work, the most valuable virtue that a farmer has is patience. And that's what James is illustrating for us here, how a farmer does what he can, but there are things that are outside of his control. And so what he does is he works hard, he's diligent, he does everything that's in his power to do, and then he just waits on the Lord, and he trusts in the Lord. That's what it's like for Christians to live in the world today while we're waiting for the coming of the Lord. We live in a world that is hostile to genuine Christianity. Christians are persecuted, mocked, killed in some parts of the world. Often the forces of evil seem more powerful than the forces of good. Money and political power seem to carry the day much more often than scruples and decency. And so we wait patiently in the Lord for God to avenge the just and to punish the wicked. And how long do we have to wait? Well, look at what he says in verse 7. We wait until the coming of the Lord. And then he says in verse 8 that the coming of the Lord is at hand. The early Christians, and you see this throughout the New Testament, they lived with an expectancy of the Lord's imminent return. In fact, Paul's first letter, the very first book that Paul wrote, 1 Thessalonians, and it was written not too awful long after the book of James, which we've just started studying and which we're looking at today. It was written because there were some Christians in that church at Thessalonica. It never dawned on them, it never occurred to them that the coming of the Lord, the return of the Lord would tarry enough that some of them would actually die before the Lord returned. But here they were, maybe 20, 22, 23 years after the resurrection. The Lord hadn't returned yet, and some of them had died. They had no idea what would happen to those believers who have died in the Lord, because we thought we'd all be alive when Jesus came back, and that's at the very core of what Paul writes about in that book of 1 Thessalonians. Now, when James says in verse 8 that the Lord's return is at hand, I pulled down about 4 commentaries out of my library to see what the commentators said about that verse. 2 of them just said flat out, James is wrong. James was wrong. He thought the Lord was going to return, and he did. I disagree with that. Now, obviously, the Lord didn't return during James's time. I'm not saying that. What I am pointing out is here we see in full evidence some of the brilliance and the uniqueness of the Word of God. Too often we think of the Bible as just a collection of stories about what people did back then or what God used to do. And we forget that the Bible is the living, breathing, powerful Word of God, written not just for the church back then, but for us today, and for the church of tomorrow, and for the church of 1,000 years from now, or until Jesus comes back. And what James is saying here, that we should live expecting the Lord's return at any day, just as they did, that's true for us today too. That's how Christians today ought to be living. Expecting the Lord's return, living as though the Lord's return might be at hand, because you know what? It just might be. Now look at what he says in verse 8. He says, establish your hearts. That, a literal translation of that would be stand firm or be steadfast. It's the same word that we see in Luke chapter 9, verse 51, when it says that Jesus set his face toward Jerusalem. In other words, from that moment on in his ministry, he was headed to the cross, and he knew it, and nothing was going to stand in his way of going to the cross. That's the same word that James uses here when he tells us, stand firm in this wicked world. Be full of resolve. He's saying, in essence, look, I know it's tough. I know it seems like evil is out of control, but stand firm until the Lord returns, because when he does, he's going to set things right. He says in verse 9 that the judge is at the door. I love these scenes on like legal shows or movies about the law. When the judge enters the courtroom, what does the bailiff say to everybody? He says, all stand. Everybody stands before the judge, right? And this is sort of the image I had in my mind when I read this verse, what James is saying, that the judge is at the door. He's ready to enter into the courtroom, and he's reminding us that perhaps very soon the judge is going to enter the world, and we will all give account of our lives. And I ask myself, and I ask you this morning, how will you fare at that judgment? When you give account of your life, your actions, your words, your attitude. In verse 9, he goes on to caution Christians about adding to one another's burdens. And this verse almost seems out of place. It almost seems like a parenthesis of what he's been saying. But I think it belongs where it is, because I think he's making a point that is in the context of this passage. What he's reminding us of is this. Your fellow Christians have a lot of burdens in this world, just like you do. Don't add to their burdens. That's a great word for us today as Christians. Just remember that just as sometimes this world is difficult for you, this life is difficult for you as a Christian, it is for your fellow Christians as well. Don't add to their burdens in the world. Or I guess later Paul would echo what James says here when he writes in Ephesians chapter 4, verse 2, and he reminds us to forbear with one another in love, to be filled with forbearance for one another. Now, so there's the first example, the farmer, the patient farmer. Then he tells us in verse 10 that another example of the kind of patience that he has in mind is the prophets. Now, he doesn't mention any prophets in particular. We could take any one of them and study their lives and see an illustration of what James has in mind here. All of them suffered for doing right. All of them suffered for serving God. A persistent attitude that I find among Christians today, American Christians in particular. I don't know that this attitude is pervasive around the world, but it is definitely pervasive in the American church, is that serving God is supposed to make your life easier. That being a faithful Christian is somehow supposed to remove problems from your life, and in some instances that's true. But somehow being a Christian is supposed to make life easier, more carefree, and some would even say wealthier. James is reminding us here that faithfully serving the Lord often adds to life's burdens. And he says that the prophets are examples of suffering, patience and suffering. Now, that word there, suffering in patience. I want to call your attention to just something of the grammar there. If I can take you back to school for just a minute. The word suffering is written in what would be called in grammar the passive voice. In other words, it's describing something that's not doing anything. An example would be like, picture a giant boulder by an ocean, and the waves come in. Imagine you're down by Laguna Beach or Malibu, someplace like that. Big waves are coming in and rolling over that boulder. What does the boulder do? Nothing. It just stands there. That's the word for suffering that he uses. It pictures something that is immovable, that in the face of difficult, heavy resistance, all it does is stand firm. But the word patience is written in the active voice, and that means it describes doing something. And that's why the word patience doesn't fully capture what James is saying, because we think of patience as just waiting, right? Sort of folding our arms, waiting around. That's not what he's saying at all. Suffering, that's passive. We just have to endure. But the patience he's describing is an active thing. It's something that we do. And he's reminding us that what the prophets did in their patience and suffering is that they kept on serving the Lord. And that's why endurance here, or perseverance, or steadfastness is a better translation of James's idea. He's saying in the midst of the suffering, which quite often you can do nothing about, you're like that giant boulder by the seashore and the waves of oppression just sweep over you. What you can actively do is keep on steadfastly serving the Lord in perseverance. Now, again, I mentioned there are all sorts of examples I could give you here. Daniel, Amos, Hosea, even Jonah. From Jonah's example, we can learn a thing or two. Let me give you just one example of one of the prophets, Jeremiah. Because his story is perhaps the most unique among the prophets. Jeremiah was called to be a prophet while he was still a teenager. He was living in some tiny little obscure country town. And the Lord called him to speak a word of judgment against the nation. And so he did. He preached a word of repentance. It was his first sermon. And after his first sermon, his own family tried to kill him. Undaunted, he went to Jerusalem, stood outside the gate of the temple, and as people were walking through the gates to worship, he said to them, "Don't even bother. This is a waste of your time, because none of you have any intention whatsoever of serving God." Can you imagine how that went over? The priests of the temple tried to kill him. They arrested him, they tortured him, they threw him in prison. While there, he wrote a prophetic book. And the aides to the king went to him and said, "You better read this," because it was a word of condemnation of him and the whole nation because of their unfaithfulness to God. And the king read it, and he was so enraged that he tore it into tiny pieces and then threw it in a fire. Finally got to be too much for Jeremiah. He got depressed, and we even know Jeremiah today as the weeping prophet. He got depressed, he got discouraged, he wanted to quit, he wanted to resign. God wouldn't let him. And so year after year, Jeremiah endured. Did he have questions for God? Yes, he questioned God. Did he complain? Yes. But he never stopped serving God. He never stopped being faithful. He never stopped persevering. That's the kind of perseverance that James is talking about here. It doesn't mean that if you get discouraged, you're not faithful. It doesn't mean that if you have doubts, you're not faithful. It doesn't mean that if you want to give up, you're not faithful. It only means you're not faithful when you do give up. That's when you become unfaithful. So long as you keep persevering, so long as you keep serving God in the midst of your struggles and doubts and discouragement. So long as you stay faithful, you're doing what James is saying here. Persevere in the midst of suffering. Now, then finally he says in verse, that's the second example, and now in verse 11 we see the third example. He tells us to be like Job. You know, you always learn something new from the Bible. I find that I do. I've been reading the Bible almost daily for 40 years. I've lost track. A long time, 40-something years. I didn't realize until I was getting this sermon together this week, this is the only time that Job is mentioned in the New Testament. That surprised me. But it is. The only time you find Job mentioned in the New Testament. And just as James earlier in the book uses Abraham as a supreme example of faith, he now uses Job as a supreme example of the kind of perseverance that he's talking about. Now, you remember the story of Job. You remember that Satan was speaking to the Lord one day, and he said, you know that guy, Job? And God said, oh yes, he's a faithful servant of mine. And Satan says to God, you know the only reason he serves you is because of all the benefits he gets from it? If you took those things away from him, or let me take them away, he would deny you in a heartbeat. I wonder how true that would be of us. If all the benefits you get from serving God, from being a Christian, were taken away, would you still serve? Would you still be faithful? That's the proposition that Satan put to God. And he said, let me test him, and you'll see. And so God gives Satan permission to do that. And Job begins to lose everything that he has. He loses his health. He loses his wealth. He loses his children. His wife says to him, clearly God hates you. You should just commit suicide. Even his well-intentioned friends come to him and they say, man, you must be some kind of a sinner for God to let all this happen to you. And for 37 chapters of that 42-chapter book, it seems like God himself is silent and unconcerned about Job. But look what he goes on to say in verse 11. He says, you have seen the purpose. Some of the translations there say that end. It's the same word. It just means you saw how the story ended. You see what God was up to all along. That's what he's saying there. Now, Job, like Jeremiah, was not patient in the sense that we normally think of patience. Unquestioning. Passive. Job had questions for God. He asked them. He wondered if God really cared about him, and he told God that. And he wanted answers. He wasn't patient in that sense, but he never stopped serving God. He persevered. When he had doubts, he kept on serving. When he had questions, he kept on serving. And in the end, he saw what God was doing. My experience in life has been that most of the lessons God teaches us, we learn in retrospect. We learn them in the rearview mirror, so to speak. While we're going through them, more often than not, we are just like Job. We don't have a clue what God is up to. It's only when we get past them and look back that we go, oh, okay. Now I see what God was doing. That's what happened with Job. At the end, he saw, and look what he says there. It was at the end that Job learned something that he didn't know yet, that God is full of compassion and mercy. And so that's what James is saying to us here. In this evil, wicked world, keep on serving God. Keep on being faithful. The day is coming when God will make his purposes clear. The day is coming when it will make sense. The day is coming when God will judge the world. And until then, keep on with your spiritual endurance in this physical world. You ever seen this Ironman triathlon World Strongman Championship? It's on every year. They show it on TV. It's It's a triathlon, 3 different things. The contestants swim for 2.4 miles in the ocean. It's held in Hawaii. They bicycle up and down hills along the Kona coast for 112 miles. And then they run a marathon, 26.2 miles. The world record is 9 hours, 5 minutes, and 57 seconds. And every year the winner is crowned as the champion. Our world places a great deal of emphasis on physical endurance, not so much on spiritual endurance. The concern of the Bible is just the opposite. The irony is that those who spend so much time on developing physical endurance are spending their time and energy and lives on things that ultimately are passing away, that are temporal. But spiritual endurance builds rewards that are eternal. In the midst of whatever persecution or oppression you face, you keep on serving God. You keep on living for Jesus. You keep being faithful in the midst of it all, knowing that the Lord's return is at hand. The day is coming when God will judge the world and make all things right. In the midst of all of that, keep on persevering in the midst of your suffering. This morning we're going to sing a song of invitation, 485 we're going to sing. Okay, stand up for Jesus.